This afternoon's speaker has served as a priest in the Church of England for over 50 years. He has a great love of the traditional Book of Common Prayer, as well as of the writings of Jane Austen. For the past 10 years, until the AGM of July this year, he served as the Vice Chairman of the Jane Austen Society UK. So for a talk entitled Jane Austen's Life, Faith and Writings, regulated and checked by the Book of Common Prayer, I'm delighted to hand over to our speaker, the Reverend Canon Michael Kenning. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Welcome to you all, and it really is a great pleasure to be able to speak to you this afternoon and to give this talk all about Jane Austen and her real devotion to the Book of Common Prayer. I think we've got the title on a slide, and I guess Edward will put that up just to remind you of the title. And I'm sure it won't come as any surprise to any of you if I tell you at the start of this talk that Jane Austen never makes direct reference to the Book of Common Prayer in any of her novels, letters, or other written items. But there are ways in which her knowledge and use of the prayer book played so profound a role in her life and in her worship and devotion as a Christian that the prayer book must have influenced several of the themes and plots of her novels. So I hope during the course of this talk to point to the ways in which the Book of Common Prayer provided a rich and subtle foundation for her life and work. And as a clergyman's daughter, Jane would have received Christian teaching from her father from her earliest years. According to her father's memorandum, all of his children were encouraged to say prayers night and morning to thank God for blessings received and to seek God's continuing protection. And her father set that example for them by leading acts of worship and prayer each day, both in the morning and in the evening. So it's more than likely that sections of the prayer book would have provided content for those daily acts of worship. And at those acts of worship, Jane would have heard many of Coverdale's version of the Psalms contained in the prayer book. Now, she may not have used all of the ones set out for each morning and evening, but nevertheless, she would have been acquainted with a fair number of those psalms. And she would have grown in increasing knowledge and appreciation of biblical passages and stories. We know too that Jane particularly treasured the gift of a copy of William Vickers' Companion to the Altar. And this booklet was given to her when she was 18, possibly at the time of her confirmation. The book comments in detail on the 1662 communion service, and it outlines the meaning of that service and offers prayers for use in advance of receiving the sacrament. And according to family members, Jane made constant use of this book, drawing on many of the prayers and meditations within it, and particularly those dealing with the practice of self-examination. Now, I'll say more about the practice of self-examination shortly, as it features prominently in the Book of Common Prayer and also plays a significant role in most of Jane's novels. But in addition to becoming familiar with the Book of Common Prayer at home and at worship in Steventon in her early years, church attendance throughout her life would have provided her with regular opportunities to become increasingly familiar with the contents of morning and evening prayer and the communion service in particular. Indeed, wherever Jane lived, there is evidence of her regular attendance at church. At Steventon, and you can see the slides of that now, at Steventon she worshipped in the company of her mother, sisters, brothers, and other members of the congregation. Then when the family moved to Bath in 1801, there are references in Jane's letters about attending worship there, and in 1806, having left Bath after her father's death and whilst living in Southampton, records show that the family paid pew rents for Sunday worship at one of the churches in Southampton. Then, when Jane, her mother, and her sister were fortunate enough to acquire the cottage at Chawton, thanks to her brother's kind provision, regular worship was paid at St. Nicholas Church, just a short walk from the cottage down the lane. In all these churches, of course, the Book of Common Prayer would have been used. The family also records that whilst at Chawton, when there was no church service, Sunday evening worship would be held at the cottage, with Jane leading the prayers whenever Sister Cassandra was away. Then, given that Jane, like Cassandra, was often away visiting family and friends in Godmersham in Kent, or her cousin, the Reverend Edward Cooper, at Hamstall Ridwar in Staffordshire, or her godfather, the Reverend Samuel Cook, at Great Bookham in Surrey, plus holidays in Dorset and Sussex, and several visits to other places. Indeed, wherever she was, worship would have been held, and the Book of Common Prayer would have been used. Even later in her life, when staying with her favourite brother Henry in London, she may have enjoyed going to theatre and concerts with him, but they also worshipped on Sunday, possibly at St. Paul's Covent Garden, but also in other London churches, because Henry quite often moved house in the city. Jane, then, would have been thoroughly acquainted with the words, statements, and themes which permeate the Book of Common Prayer. As one recent commentator on Jane's life as a Christian has suggested, during the course of her life, Jane may well have recited the Lord's Prayer in its Book of Common Prayer form more than 30,000 times. I don't think that's an exaggeration. But then Jane would also have been familiar with other contents of the Book of Common Prayer. In 1792, just before her 17th birthday, she and her sister Cassandra attended a wedding at Steventon and acted as witnesses to the marriage. The marriage register for the church shows both Jane's and Cassandra's signature. I'm certain, too, that the Book of Common Prayer title, Solemnization of Matrimony, would have fascinated her, because at some point in her years at Steventon, she was inquisitive enough to have studied the marriage register kept at the rectory. And the opening pages of the register set out what clergy need to add to the statement to read out for the banns of marriage, as well as providing what details are necessary for the marriage entry. And as you'll see on the slide, Jane inserts on the specimen page her name as the bride, but then creates a real sense of comedy by offering the names of 3 different grooms. One of those grooms has the surname Fitzwilliam, and that, of course, was Darcy's Christian name in Pride and Prejudice. So Jane may have been in the process of composing that novel. It was certainly begun at Steventon. But the comic sense of that action on the opening page of the register tunes in very well with some of the hilarious short stories Jane composed in her early years. Nevertheless, I'm sure the ceremony of marriage from the Book of Common Prayer would have been studied with care and heard with great attention at that wedding in 1792. Then again, other sections of the Book of Common Prayer might also have been well known to Jane. Her father, in preparing her for confirmation, would have spent time with her going over the questions and answers in the catechism, and her father may well have taken her through the catechism on occasions long before her confirmation. And it's significant that the final section of the catechism matches themes in the penitential introduction to morning and evening prayer as well as with themes in Vicar's Companion to the Altar. And in all these, a call is sounded for an acknowledgement of sinfulness and a willingness to repent and amend one's life. Those themes also underwrite the Book of Common Prayer commination service, and Jane's father might well have read that out to the family as appointed on the first day of Lent. It's possible, too, that Jane would have heard read forms of prayer to be used at sea, or she might even have used them herself, because two of her brothers, Francis and Charles, were naval officers who were often at sea. Frank, for instance, saw action during the Napoleonic Wars, and Charles served during the American War and protected the West Indies from the French. So Jane, I'm sure, would have offered prayers from that service for their protection whilst at sea. However well versed Jane might have been with regard to the Book of Common Prayer contents, in her novels we're never taken into the very heart of Christian worship. There are references to wedding ceremonies, but any detail of what takes place within the service is only briefly mentioned. Nevertheless, the words of worship and the themes of the Book of Common Prayer, with which Jane was thoroughly acquainted, must have led her to recognise the persistent calls on worshippers to confess their failings and lack of righteous behaviour, and to seek instead to live a more righteous and sober life. And that strong contrast between bad and good, unrighteous and righteous, is a major focus for Jane in her novels, because she presents in each novel a range of characters who are quite different when it comes to behaviour and morality. Some are worthy and wise, others are often quite obnoxious, self-seeking and vain. At a simple level, there are two important men in each novel, a hero and an anti-hero. So in Pride and Prejudice, for example, there's the high-principled Darcy contrasted with the dishonest Wickham. In Sense and Sensibility, there's the rogue Willoughby contrasted with the older and more stolid Colonel Brandon. Or in Emma, we have the upright and correct Mr. Knightley standing in sharp contrast to the devious and hypocritical Frank Churchill. And similar contrasts are also drawn between the heroines and other female characters. There's a wealth of difference between the quiet and reflective Fanny Price and the self-assertive Mary Crawford in Mansfield Park. And equally in Pride and Prejudice, there's a telling contrast between the wit and graciousness of Elizabeth Bennet and the pompous, high and mighty style of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Indeed, throughout the novels, natural human strengths and their opposite weaknesses are displayed alongside each other in such a way that the just and the unjust coexist. And that's certainly a claim consistent with biblical teaching, what with Christ's injunctions about letting wheat and tares grow together till harvest, and his observation of sun and rain falling on both the righteous and the unrighteous. And given Jane's knowledge of the Psalms in the prayer book, there are many verses which draw a similar distinction between the righteous and the unrighteous. And in addition, it's a Christian claim that all human beings have been created by God with a capacity to choose between good and evil, and to make responses that either encourage or imperil not only personal well-being, but also the good of society as a whole. And that too is a feature which we see played out time and time again throughout the novels, not only in the plots, but in the characters themselves. Indeed, that contrast between good and bad is even depicted within family life. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, or Anne Elliot and her father, couldn't be more different from each other, and the disparity in ages between Emma Woodhouse and her father is even described by Jane as an evil. And that's one of the many times Jane uses that biblical and Book of Common Prayer term in her novels. So the presentation of human strengths and weaknesses is a persistent thread running through all the novels, and human qualities such as selfishness, pride, envy, jealousy, and hypocrisy are not only laid bare in the characters, those qualities are severely criticised, and their architects are often banished from the plot and rarely meet with success and happiness. On the other hand, the characters who reveal patient fortitude, kindness, gentleness, and goodness do meet with success and acclaim. In such ways, then, Jane can be said to uphold and reinforce Christian ethical teaching and sentiments constantly expressed in the services and prayers contained in the Book of Common Prayer. But then, in addition to that capacity to choose between good and evil, Christianity also claims that God's creatures are given powers to reason, to reflect on experiences in life, leading to modification of behaviour and the acquisition of some greater good and greater personal maturity. And that's not only a dominant theme in many of the Book of Common Prayer services and prayers, it also is highlighted in all of Jane's novels as many of the characters reflect on what they have done, how badly they have behaved, or how foolish they have been in their thinking. Indeed, in many ways, I think it's a theme which gets stronger and stronger as Jane moves through her writings, and it seems to reach its zenith in Emma, where the heroine is made to engage in several acts of reflection and self-examination before she can reach a point of maturity and receive full acclaim from Mr. Knightley and his willingness to marry her. Through a series of painful humiliations, the novelist makes Emma pay for her mistakes, and the closing sections of that novel underline the need for honest self-appraisal and an admission of the errors common to humanity. Jane comments, "With insufferable vanity had Emma believed herself in the secret of everybody's feelings. With unpardonable arrogance proposed to arrange everybody's destiny. She was proved to have been universally mistaken, and she had not quite done nothing, for she had done mischief." And that's a theme which is certainly there in Jane's earlier novels. Indeed, in Sense and Sensibility, the religious term conversion seems particularly appropriate in relation to how Marianne Dashwood gradually changes from a highly emotional person, somebody who's rash and ungenerous in her judgments, to someone far more forgiving, tolerant, and kindly. Marianne contritely assesses all that has happened to her when she realizes that Willoughby has deserted her. She admits that it would be idle to claim that she could ever forget Willoughby. His remembrance, she declares, can be overcome by no change of circumstances or opinions, but it shall be regulated, it shall be checked by religion. You can see now why the title of this talk had those two words, regulated and checked, in relation to the Book of Common Prayer. Because checked by religion clearly suggests some spiritual dimension and the use of personal reflection, meditation, and prayer. And it's those practices which are strongly advised in the services and prayers of the Book of Common Prayer. It's interesting too that when Marianne falls ill with pneumonia, she is one of very few characters in the novels to make mention of God. She says this: "My illness has made me think. It has given me leisure and calmness for serious recollection. I saw in my own behaviour nothing but a series of imprudence towards myself and want of kindness to others. With such feelings as these reflections gave me, I wonder at my recovery, wonder that to have time for atonement to my God and to you all did not kill me at once." Now, the word atonement is, of course, found in the Book of Common Prayer, and particularly in the communion service. A similar journey towards penitence and greater self-understanding is made by Catherine Morland in Northanger Abbey, when she comes to terms with what is real rather than imaginary. Catherine may start out, as Jane declares, as ignorant and uninformed as the female mind at 17 usually is. But all the delusions she has about Northanger Abbey are challenged and eventually demolished, because Catherine doesn't find the late Mrs. Tilney murdered or shut up in her bedchamber. The room turns out to be large, neat, and sunny, and Catherine is caught there unexpectedly by Henry Tilney, only to be humiliated and brought down to earth. Indeed, in summing up the whole charade, the novelist declares, nothing could be clearer than that it had been all a voluntary, self-created delusion, each trifling circumstance receiving importance from an imagination resolved solely on fancy. And in religious terms, that strong note of censure which Jane makes towards Catherine perhaps echoes the judgment Christ made over the pretense and hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, and his warnings to them in the Sermon on the Mount that they were destined to receive condemnation. And that sense of God's judgment is also voiced in the Book of Common Prayer Commination service and in many of the Psalms. But the journey towards greater self-understanding isn't just for the novelist's characters who are young in years and overtaken by emotion or delusion. It's also a journey made by those who are rather more mature and stable psychologically. So, for instance, even Elizabeth Bennet makes something of a pilgrimage through Pride and Prejudice. It's not only a physical journey from Longbourn to Pemberley via Hunsford, it's necessary travel, during which Elizabeth is converted in her attitude to Darcy, and through which she moves from initial contempt to ambivalence, on to gratitude, and finally to successful and happy marriage. Indeed, when Elizabeth receives Darcy's letter following her rejection of his initial proposal of marriage, she too, through a similar process of reflection, recognizes and admits that she has been blind, partial, prejudiced, and absurd, and it leads her to declare, "Till this moment, I never knew myself." Some of the men, too, are shown to own up to their particular weaknesses and failings. Towards the end of Mansfield Park, Sir Thomas Bertram laments his failings and realizes his absence from Mansfield has led to the moral collapse of his children. And here Jane spells out in very clear terms some very telling Christian lessons. Here, she says of Sir Thomas, had been grievous mismanagement. Something must have been wanting within. They had been instructed theoretically in their religion, but never required to bring it into daily practice, and of the necessity of self-denial and humility, he feared they had never heard from any lips that could profit them. In such ways as these, Jane draws very close ties with the practice of Christian spirituality and the ways in which it encourages reflection and readiness to amend one's life so that personal integrity, self-awareness, and maturity can be gained. And this is again a practice strongly advised in the Catechism and in other sections and prayers of the Book of Common Prayer. And Jane herself, as we know from her prayers and letters, recognised human failings in herself and the value of endeavouring to correct them with the help of God's grace. It is those same ideas which are fully underlined in her novels. Now, I spoke earlier of Jane's acquaintance with the Psalms and how their form from the Book of Common Prayer would have been used when she attended church worship and when services and prayers were held at home. Now, there may be no direct quotations from Scripture in Jane's novels, but there are certainly two references to the Psalms. In Emma, Miss Bates eulogizes over the suitability of Highbury as a place in which to reside, and she declares, "Our lot is cast in a goodly heritage." Now, Coverdale's version of Psalm 16, verse 7 in the BCP reads as follows: "The lot is fallen unto me in a fair ground, yea, I have a goodly heritage." I think Miss Bates appears to contract the two phrases of that verse, and the word lot is transferred from the first phrase to the second. If you go to the King James version of the Psalms, that clearly doesn't apply, as it reads quite differently. So I wonder then, did Jane deliberately allow Miss Bates to misquote the BCP Psalm? In the novel, Miss Bates, on another occasion, is certainly treated quite unkindly. She's made fun of by Emma Woodhouse. And given Jane's often acid humour, expressed particularly in her letters, it may be that Jane herself was poking fun at Miss Bates. Miss Bates was, after all, the daughter of a clergyman, so maybe, in Jane's estimation, Miss Bates ought to have known the psalm much better. Then a second reference to the Psalms comes towards the end of Pride and Prejudice, when a letter from the Reverend Mr. Collins is received by Elizabeth's father, and he tells Elizabeth that a section of the letter is about Collins' wife and their expectation of a young olive branch. Psalm 128, verses 3 and 4, may well have been in Jane's mind when writing this, because the verses read, "Thy wife shall be as the fruitful vine upon the walls of thine house, thy children like the olive branches round about thy table." I wonder too if some of the Psalms encouraged Jane to include in her novels occasional detailed accounts of the wonders of the universe and the beauty of the countryside. In Mansfield Park, as Fanny Price and Edmund Bertram stand by a window, they enjoy the brilliance of an unclouded night and point to the shining out of Arcturus and Cassiopeia in the night sky. I wonder then whether Psalms 19 and 104 in particular, which proclaim the glories of the heavens and call for a sense of praise for God's creative power, whether that's echoed in Fanny Price's words of wonder at what she sees and witnesses. Again, with Psalms such as 65 and 148 and many others which declare the beauty of landscape, nature and vegetation, and all the provision God has created, it may be that Jane was led to describe in detail the landscapes at Southerton in Mansfield Park, the glories of the grounds at Pemberley in Pride and Prejudice, or the beauty of the Jurassic coastline in Persuasion, and many other references to land and countryside in her writings. Now, I spoke earlier of Jane's inquisitive study of the marriage registers at Steventon when she was composing Mansfield Park. I think a similar inquisitive streak was at work. That novel is set in Northamptonshire, and Jane wanted to ensure that her description of the countryside in that county was accurate. So in January 1813, she wrote to her sister to ask what many might think was a rather unimportant question, whether the county actually had any hedgerows. Well, it seems the answer was yes, as the word certainly appears in the novel. But more importantly, Jane needed an inquisitive approach when it came to writing about ordination in that novel. Most of the 1662 books of common prayer used by lay people in Jane's day had been published by John Baskerville in 1762, but they did not include the ordinal services for the ordination of deacons and priests. Yet Jane's knowledge of the contents of the ordinal is very apparent when you look at the novel. So she may have made inquiries with her brother James, who'd been ordained in 1788, or he may have owned a copy of the 1662 ordinal, which Jane might have studied. Because in the novel, Edmund Bertram, prior to his ordination, has to counter Mary Crawford's attempt to destroy his sense of vocation. Mary even goes so far as to declare, "A clergyman is nothing." Edmund, however, stands his ground and reveals a depth of understanding about priestly ministry which fully accords with the statements about ministry in the 1662 ordinal. So the ordaining bishop in the preface leading up to the moment of ordination stresses the gravity of ministerial office and uses words such as dignity, importance, and weight. Edmund, too, refers to priesthood being of first importance to mankind and goes on to speak of its dimension and power not only for individuals and communities, but bearing consequences which are both temporal and eternal. There are also similarities between the style of living the Church believes must be displayed by the priest and the responsibilities Edmund claims he will adopt. The ordination service demands, both in the preface and in the questions addressed to ordinands, that they be wholesome and godly examples and patterns for the people to follow. Here again, Edmund admirably captures those demands when he speaks of the manners which result from the influence of religion and morals, and how a priest's general conduct, rather than any skill as a preacher, will be useful in a parish. I'll just let you for a moment compare the words from the ordinal and the words in Mansfield Park from Jane Austen, and you'll see just how close they are. Now, having turned attention to the clerical profession, I think it's fascinating how Jane Austen, as the daughter and sister within a clerical family, actually has the audacity to present in her novels a number of clergymen who are totally unlike her gentle and wise father or her studious brother James, who was also much admired for his pastoral ministry at Steventon, following his father. So why does Jane present the likes of the obsequious Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice, or the greedy bon vivant Dr. Grant in Mansfield Park, or the rampant and rakish Reverend Mr. Elton in Emma? Well, of course, in her day, as in any age, faults and failings do mark the clerical profession. So Jane would fully appreciate that clergy share the same fallen condition as the rest of humanity. That she might also have read the 39 Articles of Religion set out in the final pages of the Book of Common Prayer, or she may have heard her father or brother speak about them. You can see Article 26 on the screen now. It's entitled "Of the Unworthiness of the Ministers," and it emphasises that personal failings in a minister in no way diminish the effectiveness of preaching the Lord's word or of administering the sacraments. That claim, I think, might well have given Jane license to portray those three clergymen with all their failings. Let me now turn to a number of ways in which a strong connection can be noted between the Book of Common Prayer and Jane Austen when it comes to literary and writing styles. It's well known that Cranmer was partial to writing in word triplets. In the Book of Common Prayer's general thanksgiving, there's "We bless thee for our creation, preservation, and all the blessings of this life." And in the marriage service, there's a direction not to enter into marriage unadvisedly, lightly, or wantonly. As a further example, in the second collect at evening prayer and its address to God, "from whom all holy desires, all good counsels, and all just works do proceed." And then supremely in the prayer of consecration at the Holy Communion, there's even a double triplet, 3 adjectives plus 3 nouns, declaring the redemptive work of Christ on the cross as a full, perfect, and sufficient sacrifice, oblation, and satisfaction for the sins of the whole world. Now, Jane, too, was fond of word triplets. At the tender age of 15, when she wrote a witty version of the history of England, she introduced herself as a partial, prejudiced, and ignorant historian. Then in Pride and Prejudice, when Elizabeth receives a letter from Darcy commenting on Wickham's profligate character, she is oppressed with astonishment, apprehension, and horror. And in the final sentence of Emma, and in the first sentence of Emma, the heroine is introduced as handsome, clever, and rich. And when several of the characters in that novel take a walk to Abbey Mill Farm, they appreciate the sweet view, English verdure, English culture, English comfort. And there are certainly a lot of other triplets in Jane's novels. And there's a similarity too in the composition of sentences and paragraphs in both writers. Sentences are often quite long. Semicolons proliferate, and there can be sudden shifts in tone and content. Jane, of course, was writing well after Cranmer, and she fashioned a number of new literary devices, but I'm sure she learnt quite a lot from Cranmer's style. That is certainly so when it comes to 3 prayers, which were found in a collection of papers and other items by Jane's sister Cassandra after Jane's death. Whether Jane actually wrote all the prayers is uncertain. Cassandra may have written on one of the sheets prayers composed by my ever dear sister Jane, but only one sheet is considered to be in Jane's handwriting. But the language and style of the prayers is modelled very closely on prayers in the Book of Common Prayer. Phrases such as faith and fear, fatherly goodness, and thought, words, and actions are just a slight change from the Book of Common Prayer's language, and particularly so with the phrase thought, word, and deed in the general confession in the communion service. And many other connections can also be noted. Here's a brief example of the prayer which we think Jane may have written. But even if Jane didn't compose all three prayers, the fact that they were amongst her possessions suggests that she may well have used them for her private devotions, given the depth and importance she attached in her life to prayer and worship. Now, when her favourite brother Henry composed words for Jane's gravestone in Winchester Cathedral, it's significant that he emphasised Jane's life of charity, devotion, faith, and purity. Yet he made no mention at all of her talent and skill in writing novels. In fact, Jane's identity as an author was a secret known by only a few outside her immediate family. Yet in 1821, just 4 years after her death, Richard Whately, who later became Archbishop of Dublin, was one of the first to offer a commentary on Jane's writings. In the quarterly review of that year, Whately praised Jane for being evidently a Christian writer without being at all obtrusive. And that assessment can equally be made as a result of the strong connections between many of the themes and prayers of the Book of Common Prayer and Jane's moral stance and expressions within her novels. Let me end then by emphasizing that for Jane, the Book of Common Prayer would not only have been in use throughout her life, both at church and at home, but it would certainly have offered her a hugely influential force in her life as a Christian and in her work as a writer. So there we are.
Canon, thank you so much for that superb presentation in which you showed us how well you know not just the Book of Common Prayer, but of course Jane Austen's works. I'm sure we've all learned an awful lot from what you've shared with us this afternoon. There's an opportunity now for us to take questions briefly. So if anyone wishes to ask a question, would you please indicate by using the Zoom reactions and raising a yellow hand? And then I will call you and invite you to unmute and put your question to our speaker. Mr. Thame, please. If you'd like to unmute, thank you.
There, I finally managed it. Thank you so much for that. I'm very persuaded the influence of Cranmer's English on Jane Austen's English. I'm a bit less persuaded on her Christian ethics and morality, which I think are much more widely disseminated, so much harder to pin down to the Book of Common Prayer, except perhaps in one or two areas. And I'm thinking here of the authorial voice's reaction to, and the central character's reaction to, Mr. Bennet and Frank Churchill. It's not clear, perhaps it's not very clear, what Elizabeth Bennet thinks of Mr. Bennet at the end of the Pride and Prejudice, and it's not particularly clear what the reader perhaps is meant to think of Mr. Bennet. And the same with Frank Churchill. What precisely is the authorial voice and Emma meant to think of Frank Churchill? And there is a little bit of novelty in the morality there, and I wonder if you could draw out that novelty, if I'm right in thinking it is novel.
Yes, I think it's an interesting point. I mean, the thing that comes straight to my mind is what Mr. Bennett says about hmm, yes, about Mr. Collins, when Collins suggests that Lydia and Wickham need to be forgotten completely, basically. And Mr. Bennett says that's his notion of Christian forgiveness. Yeah, he's really quite critical, and I think that seems to me to express a Christian idea that there needs to be an acceptance of those who have perhaps gone astray and been misled, and a willingness to reinstate them and to show kindness and care for those in that sort of position. Um, I think there are elements of real Christian thinking in the novels, and a lot of those ideas, I'm sure, are encouraged, inspired by the Book of Common Prayer. I'm not sure that answers your question, though.
Any more questions, please? Mr. Bremner, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for that. It was fascinating. You mentioned at one point when you were talking about the psalm, the allusions to the Psalms, how in particular, I've lost where I wrote it down, but there was one point where we could tell it was Coverdale, not the AV. Do you, as you read the novels, are there times when you, presumably you do see a lot of evidence of the authorized version as well in her writing, which obviously also would have been a huge part, presumably, of her spirituality through the services and things. Is that something you're able to comment on?
Yes, I mean, I'm sure that the authorized version played a significant role, but I think too the prayer book does. The two need to go hand in hand, I'm sure. Um, and certainly the point about the Psalms is that, she would only have made that comment, the comments, by using the text from the prayer book, Coverdale's version. Yeah. Mm. But certainly a lot of the ideas from the authorized version, I'm sure, encouraged her in her writings. Yeah.
Are there any further questions, comments, observations?
Hello.
Mrs. Comer?
Hello. It's often said, and I think incorrectly, that Jane Austen had a poor opinion of clergymen because some of her clergymen are not very good clergymen. And I think that maybe doesn't take into account the heroes who are clergymen.
Mm. Yes, that's right. I mean, in Jane's life, she met, huge number of clergy. Um, for instance, her cousin up in Hamstall Ridware, I made comment about him. She didn't like him at all because he preached such long sermons and he was full of evangelical zeal. And you may know that towards the end of Jane's life, she was rather ambivalent about the evangelicals. She wasn't altogether certain that she should disregard them. She felt that there might be a case for them. So she wasn't at all clear where she stood on that. But certainly she could be quite critical of the clergy who possibly seemed questionable in terms of their ministerial work. Yeah. Mm.
Oh, hello, it's Elizabeth. Can I ask a question, please?
Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I failed to find the hand to put up, I'm afraid. Thank you for an excellent talk, Canon. Really, really good. You mentioned right at the beginning that when Jane lived in Southampton, she paid a pew rent to a church in Southampton. Do you know which one?
Yeah. I don't, I'm afraid. No, I don't think the church is standing now, from what I remember, but I can't give you the name of the church. There may be some reference in Claire Tomlin's book on Jane Austen.
Yes, I'll look in that one. There's very, very little known about their time in Southampton, whereas we know everywhere they lived in Bath and you know, I think they were quite poor, and I think they were probably in
They were
but
struggling.
and it wasn't till Edward Austen Knight stepped in. But if I ever get to retire, my research would be finding Jane Austen in Southampton.
Yes.
Because Southampton was heavily bombed during the war, but I mean there must be somewhere you could find it.
Yeah.
But thank you for an excellent talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
A final question, if there is one.
May I ask a question, please?
Yeah,
It's John
Mr. Watterson.
Thank you very much. The first questioner asked about Mr. Bennet and his daughter Elizabeth, my comment is that one shouldn't look at characters as being either black or white. Mr. Bennet, I think, is one of those ones that shades of grey. There is a reference in the novel to Elizabeth and I think her elder sister Jane being aware of the impropriety of their father's treatment of their mother. He's come to regard her as a ridiculous person, which in many ways she is, and is depicted as such by Jane Austen, and that he is improper in the way he's constantly setting her up as a figure of fun and poking fun at her. And there's also later on, when Mr. Collins is due to come to stay at Longbourn, that Mr. Bennet says that he's in high hopes of finding him a most ridiculous person, or words to that effect. The tone of Mr. Collins's letter leads him to hope that he will be completely absurd. Now that is obviously a very uncharitable outlook by Mr. Bennet, and therefore is a point definitely in his disfavour. But nevertheless, he is presented, I think rightly, as essentially a good man whose heart is in the right place in most respects, and who wants to do the best for his daughters and so on. And when Lydia, of course, gets into trouble, he is absolutely tireless in his efforts to retrieve the situation for her and to see her respectably married. So that's my comment on that particular point that's been raised.
And there's that other point where Mr. Bennet questions whether Mr. Collins is a sensible man.
Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed, and that is the one I was referring to.
Yes, of course.
Indeed, he says, yeah. I'm hoping to find him in the exact reverse, yes. Something like that.
Yes, something like that.
Thank you very much indeed for the questions, and to you, Canon, for the answers. I hope you've enjoyed giving this talk and responding to the questions as much as we've enjoyed hearing the wisdom that you've shared with us.
Thank you very much indeed.